Civil war averted, pomp and circumstance restored. The Kremlin loves its ballet of the boots. But what this crisis has revealed is the hollowness of the great Russian state behind the facade. The minute's silence is for the Russian airmen killed by fellow Russians, the Wagner troops, on Saturday as they advanced on Moscow. Behind the grandiose strikes of destiny, the tawdry reality revealed that Russia descended into a mafia-style turf war. The commander-in-chief thanked the Russian troops for resisting Russian troops.
You protected the Constitution and the lives, the safety, the freedom of our people. You saved our motherland from turmoil. In fact, you stopped a civil war.
In a bunker, not a palace, someone else was thanking his troops for also resisting Russians. President Zelensky, no pomp, just circumstance, displaying in spades what Putin now knows he lacks in equal measure: loyalty from his men and from his people. With his signature selfies displaying once again that the ability to communicate is indispensable to leadership, especially in a time of war.
70%!
Someone else who has mastered social media but has barked his way to leadership is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner warlord. After some back and forth, the investigation into his treason in Russia has now been dropped in return for his troops handing over their heavy weapons. The former pastry chef, who's made a career and a fortune out of death and destruction, has taken up the Kremlin's invitation to move to exile in neighboring Belarus. His plane made the short hop to Minsk today, although no one can really imagine Mr. Prigozhin taking up golf and retirement. And that includes his new host, veteran autocrat President Lukashenko of Belarus, another man in another palace talking to men weighed down by metal. Usually known for being Putin's wingman, Lukashenko is now basking in the glory of having negotiated the deal that prevented civil war in Russia. But what must be playing on his mind, and theirs, is whether welcoming Wagner will turn out to be a good idea or not. Lukashenko said that his own army could benefit from the expertise of these men who were occupying Rostov-on-Don just a few days ago. Many of them hardened criminals freed from jail for their military service and now experienced warriors. There's surely only one response to having them as your house guests. Careful what you wish for. Now some breaking news. Just in the last hour, there have been reports of a Russian missile strike in central Kramatorsk, that's in eastern Ukraine. Videos have been circulating on Telegram of the aftermath of a strike in a residential area. A shopping center has been destroyed. The number of casualties is still unknown. The city of Kramatorsk has been targeted before. An attack last April on a train station there left 63 civilians dead. Well, earlier this afternoon, I spoke to Russian opposition politician Grigory Yavlinsky. He previously stood in a presidential election against Vladimir Putin. I asked him what he made of Yevgeny Prigozhin effectively being given a pardon, while other peaceful opposition protesters, like Alexei Navalny, are serving long prison sentences.
We are against this system already more than 20 years. We think that reforms which were made after the collapse of the Soviet Union were wrong reforms, and they created authoritarian, almost totalitarian regime in Russia. This is not a system with a rule of law. This is something completely different. This is a corporation, this is a corporative state with the oligarchic rule. That's what it is. This have nothing in common with democracy and liberal politics or European politics, or I would say with the politics of the 21st century.
The fact that you're in Moscow and that you're this outspoken and that people like you tend to end up in jail when they say things like this makes you a very courageous man. I just wonder what hope you have for the moderate opposition to come out of this crisis stronger.
Yes, but we would be, at the end of the story, we would be stronger because the people sooner or later would understood that we were right in the last dozens of years. But when that happens, it's a big question mark. And what will happen with us just today, tomorrow, just immediately after your interview would go into air, nobody knows. It's always a big question mark. But we
So
are
you're afraid that you might get
position.
arrested as a result of this interview?
Why not? And also without this interview as well. So we are in a position that we have to use every opportunity to speak with the people, to explain to the people what's going on.
If Mr. Putin were ever to be removed from power, do you think the person most likely to take over from him would be someone as extreme as Mr. Prigozhin or someone like Mr. Navalny, who's currently in jail?
This is kind of a fantasies. And as a fantasy, I can say that if this change would happen now, the person which would come on his place would be much worse than he. If that would happen tomorrow, if that would happen later, after the serious developments and different events, that can be a little bit different. But it's not the easy story. It's not a story type of fairy tale that today the sun would come and everything would be changed in one day. That wouldn't happen in that way.
Grigory Yevlinsky, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And that was the Russian politician Grigory Yevlinsky speaking to me from Moscow a little bit earlier. Well, I also caught up with Sir Richard Sheriff. He's the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and is here in Kyiv to help Ukraine prepare its case for joining NATO, something it'll argue for at next month's Vilnius summit. I asked him about his particular worries regarding the current state of affairs in Moscow.
I think the real issue with Prigozhin's private army is that we have had a glimpse of where Russia could go over the next decade, and a glimpse of what could become chaos in Russia with gangster leaders leading their private armies, slugging it out in a nation with 6,000 nukes.
Is that what kept you awake at the weekend?
And that is, well, I think I was on a train to Kiev over the weekend, so that, nothing kept me awake there because the train was absolutely superb. But I mean, my God, this is it's the long-term implications of this for Europe, for NATO, are massive, and this is something that the NATO summit really needs to be getting on board about.
But the other problem, which we keep circling back to, is that NATO really has no idea, the Russians don't either, who would replace Putin if he were to go.
So
right?
we have to
and this has exposed that crisis.
It does. But one's been saying all the way along the line, don't assume when Putin does go that he's going to be replaced by some flag-waving, sandal-wearing liberal bearing olive branches, because he's not. We saw a glimpse of that. It'll be a monster like Prigozhin or somebody equally hardline, determined to rebuild a second Russian empire, determined to destroy Ukraine as a country.
You don't think there's a moderate option here to
I don't think
replace
so.
him?
No, we've got to assume the worst case. And I say, we've had a glimpse of the sort of chaos that could emerge, and it'll be some brutish strongman who emerges. And the so what for NATO, the so what for the transatlantic community, is assume the worst and assume that the only way that we are going to build security for Europe long term, maintain security for long term, is a deterrent band of steel around Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, maybe one day Belarus, with Ukraine firmly part of the NATO alliance, as with the other countries. That's the only way we'll have a Europe whole, free and secure.
So the fact that this immediate crisis has fizzled the way that it has done, that there was a deal done, that takes the pressure off NATO to really concentrate its minds
doesn't.
and in theory it does.
On the contrary, I think it should make NATO wake up. Again and again with NATO summits, they can be long on rhetoric and short on action.
So long-range weapons, air support,
the means to really poke Russia in the eye, the means to sink the Black Sea Fleet, the means to drop the Kerch Bridge, and a recognition that Ukraine has got to have a fast track into the alliance, because the alliance will be safer as a result.
Final question, getting back to the original crisis in Moscow this weekend. It does seem as if Vladimir Putin, although he has prevailed on the surface, has been critically weakened by this in terms of the aura of his power and his authority. Is that good news for people here, for the Ukrainians, for NATO, or not?
Well, it is. I mean, instead of Peter the Great, he's Putin the Small. He's completely failed. He's demonstrated that he has feet of clay. Here's the man who was promising fire and brimstone, and he's done a deal with mutineers who have killed Russian soldiers. Believe that. Now, what's good for Ukraine, of course, is dissension, disunity, failure of unity of command, and the demonstration that a gang of gangsters could take control of the headquarters of the Southern Military Command and then march to within 200 kilometers of Moscow. I mean, it's unbelievable. However, let's not kid ourselves. The Ukrainians have got a really tough fight. And we shouldn't assume, as President Zelensky said, this isn't Hollywood. This is the most difficult fight.
Richard Cherov, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.